Oh, hey there, everyone. My name is CJ. I'm the youth minister. And to my right is
Francis Melman.
And to my left is
Emily Shadwell.
And we are doing the very first Teen Talk video. That was the very first time that we've come up with them. We've gone through silly titles. But anyway, in this Teen Talk, we want to bring to you 5 Bible study tools and habits. One of the most common search things when it comes to Bible studies is how to. And so if you look on Google or even YouTube, you'll notice Bible study how to videos because people have a desire to study the Bible. They just don't know how. And so in this video, our goal is to go through 5 simple tips to help you be able to study the Bible faster. Francis, what would be one thing that is important to studying the Bible?
Knowing who wrote it.
Knowing who wrote it. So that makes a big difference in the way we interpret things because having an idea of who the author is influences the way we read things. Paul was a New Testament author, and he wrote a lot of the letters to the churches, and knowing that he wrote these letters makes a big deal on the way that we look at what's being written. And so if we were to look at Romans chapter 1, verse 1, Francis, read that first line.
Paul, a servant of Christ, of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle.
So that's simple enough. In the very first verse, Paul specifically mentions that he is the author of the letter to the Romans. And that's very common in a lot of different writings. However, in the book of Hebrews, there's no explicit mention of the author. So that makes the book of Hebrews a bit of a mystery for us. We have a harder time knowing who that is. And so scholars around the world who have spent years and years and years of studying the Bible still can't come up with a definitive statement as to who wrote this. And I think that makes the Bible somewhat fascinating, or adds to how fascinating it is, because not knowing things makes us want to learn more and study more. But in these certain contexts, knowing who the author is certainly influences the way that we read things, their reading styles, the things that they believe, some things that they hold more firm than others, and things that even strengthen your faith and belief. All of those things can be found within who was actually writing that particular letter. Now, another thing, number 2, one of the things that you can use to study is knowing the timing of when things were written. I'm going to use Paul as an example again because he is a New Testament writer, and that means he wrote many things, or he wrote everything after Jesus's life, ministry, death, burial, and resurrection. And so Jesus in his life and everything that happened plays a huge role in all of what Paul writes. In fact, every letter that we come across points back to the cross and points back to the example that Jesus lived. And so out of those influences, we can know that the timing and the events of what Jesus had done in the cross play a vital role in what Paul does. Now, in the Old Testament, we have prophecies of who Jesus is, but these all came before Jesus lived. One of my favorites is found in Isaiah. And when we read Isaiah, we see this prophecy of this suffering servant. And as you read them, you start to pick up on that it's describing Jesus. And that adds to even more interest. And when you're reading that and you're studying that it came hundreds of years before Jesus ever lived, and it becomes this shocking moment where you get to experience God revealing something that was special, even in his plan of salvation, long before Jesus even came to earth. Number 3, we talk about the purpose. And the purpose is mainly why this author chose to write this book or this letter, however it is. And the purpose and intentions for these, again, play a huge role for us. If we know the purpose and intention for why an author wrote it, we're going to be looking closely for those things. I like using 1 Corinthians as an example because in the beginning of that letter, Paul is talking to a church that is just totally spun out of control. They have people in their church that are going through some inappropriate practices. They have church leaders who are approving of those practices, and they've totally abandoned what they were first taught. And so Paul writes this letter to address all of those things, and he's very upfront about it. And even in certain areas, he calls people out by name. having the purpose to what he's writing. As we continue reading through all the chapters of Corinthians, you start to realize that Paul's trying to just give them some kind of organization. You don't do these wrong things I told you not to do. You start doing the right things I told you to do. You start doing them in this method and at these times. And he simply just gives them this layout of what church is supposed to look like, and that they've been doing it totally wrong, and that they were totally backwards, and that they just need to improve that. Number 4 is our context. You got to ask yourself, what's the context of the passages? One of my favorite examples to use there is John 3:16. Everyone knows John 3:16. In fact, John 3:16 is one of the most frequently quoted passages in all the Bible. We talked about this earlier, how John 3:16 can be seen on signs in sports stands, and it can be read on posters, and it can be seen on t-shirts and everywhere. But I'm going to ask my co-host Emily to read John 3 verse 16.
For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life.
Now that's good to know, and it means a lot for us. But there's context that plays a huge role as to how we can even discover what meaning this verse may have. In verses prior to verse 16, namely looking at verses 1 through 15, there's this conversation between a man named Nicodemus and Jesus. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He didn't want to be seen in public with Jesus, although he was a follower of Jesus. He heard the things that Jesus would teach, and he'd be interested in them, and he'd want to learn more. However, Jesus challenged many of the beliefs that the Pharisees held. They were very traditional in their thinking, and so when Jesus would come to recorrect some of the teachings that they've been doing and acknowledging how they've been wrong, it began to ruffle some feathers. Now, Nicodemus was one who was faithful to hearing what Jesus taught, and so he came to him after all this teaching, and it was kind of night, and he begins to ask Jesus these questions, and Jesus simply answers the questions by addressing this issue that Nicodemus has and simply believing the very words that Jesus says. So in verse 10, Jesus says, "You're Israel's teacher," to Nicodemus. He addresses him that way. "And you don't understand these things? Very truly I tell you, we speak of what we know, and we testify to what we have, to what we've seen. But still you people do not accept our testimony. I've spoken to you of earthly things, and you don't believe. How then will you believe it if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the Son who came from heaven, the Son of Man. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes," see that word, "may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." You can see the way faith and belief plays out in just this conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus. That Jesus recognizes that Nicodemus has this challenge of believing what Jesus is teaching. He wants to, he's just having a hard time addressing it and being challenged by it. And then Jesus tells us that whoever believes will be saved. And that those who believe, Jesus didn't come to condemn them, to point a finger at them and say you're a bad person and you deserve to go to hell. No. He says that he came to save people through him. That's a huge thing. And knowing the context that surrounds this gives us an idea of the conversation that Jesus is having. And finally, what it means for us. And number 5, the question that you would ask is, how do we use this? That's what I call the application. Just about anything, even in schools, you have different textbooks that teach you something, and then there's a segment of application. So, for instance, if you're reading a math equation and it tells you a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and then it gives you the application, and then it gives you side A and side B, and you got to do the math to find out what side C is. That's for triangles, right?
Pythagorean theorem.
See, I remember. It's
Pythagorean
Pythagorean theorem.
Pythagorean theorem.
Pythagorean. We don't even know how to say it. I don't know.
Pythagorean
theorem.
You're the only one that doesn't know how to say it.
So in textbooks, we get told how to apply certain things. This is the most important thing because that's what makes a difference in our lives. It's how we answer the question, so what? If I read the Bible all day long and I don't have a so what, I can't use it. None of what is written in here matters to me. But if when looking at this example of John 3:16, the application for me is the same application for Nicodemus. That Jesus is taught many things. And a lot of those things can be challenging. A lot of those things can be confusing. And it's even in today's day and age trying to tell someone that a guy lived on earth and he took 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed 5,000 people. That's insanity to us. But when we apply our faith to it, we begin to trust these things that Jesus taught. And our faith begins to grow. And then when we see John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Jesus is the Son of God. That whoever believes in him will not perish, but they will have eternal life. And we see that faith and believing hinge on that thing. And that if we want to answer, how can I be saved? It comes down to believing in who Jesus is. All of these things, studying the Bible, can be simply boiled down to asking yourself 5 simple questions. Who is the author? What was the timing? What is the purpose? What is the context? And how do we apply this? We call that authorship. We call it timing. We call it purpose. We call it context, and we call it application. Those 5 simple tools are going to enable you to have a better Bible study, whether it's on your own or with a group of people, whether you're in small group or youth group, or even at your own family dinner table. These things will be able to improve the way you read and study the Bible. Well, that's all we have for today. I really appreciate you guys listening to us for however long this is. This is my buddy Francis. This is my friend Emily. We are out, and we hope to see you guys next time.